On September 17th, 2021, Squid Game is released on Netflix and skyrocketed to #1 in 94 countries, with 142 million households tuning in within just 28 days. But what if I told you that the series that inspired it had multiple betrayals, more gut-wrenching than Ali's marbles, games far more intense than Mingle, and twists unlike any series you've ever seen? Because you may have heard that the writer based it on his own economic struggles and South Korea's wealth inequality. And of course, Squid Games is hardly subtle with its critique of capitalism. However, what you probably didn't know was that he was also a huge fan of gambling manga, specifically Battle Royale, Liar Game, and above all, Kaiji. Which, in addition to being perfect if you're looking for something to give you a kick to finally get your shit together, is also the most intense, heart-pounding roller coaster of devastation and triumph I've ever seen. And its influence on Squid Games is immediately apparent for anyone who's seen the two series. The premise is virtually identical. However, it follows an extremely different approach. Unlike the rapid-paced death games of Squid Games, Kaiji lets that tension linger. It makes you feel every ounce of their desperation to win and the horror of the consequences if they don't. It introduces games that are seemingly simple on the surface, but are then broken apart down to the tiniest detail by those clawing for an advantage to help them survive. I'm not criticizing Squid Game here because I really enjoyed it, and will definitely be watching the entirety of Season 3 as soon as it comes out on Friday. But Kaiji is something else entirely. In addition to the games themselves being far more interesting, I think the one thing that allows Kaiji to do everything with so much more intensity is that you genuinely have no idea how each game is going to go. In Squid Game Season 1, it's extremely obvious that Ji-Hung and Sang-woo would be the two finalists. It's still incredibly entertaining, but let's be real, you knew that they'd be the final two, and every other character you saw would die before that. But without the threat of literal death at every turn, Kaiji can and does lose multiple times. And speaking of our main character, Ito Kaiji is someone incredibly relatable to me. He's directionless and drifting, having just been let go from his previous job, and I think regardless of where you're from, we can all relate to that all-consuming, horrid feeling of what am I doing? Of wasting our days and wishing we weren't, wishing we had something that we cared about. But in spite of that slogan on the wall, the future is in our hands, Kaiji does nothing but drink and gamble and sit in misery. He distracts himself from his reality to avoid facing it. He knows there's no use in crying and dwelling in that despair, but he doesn't see a way out until a loan shark asks him a horrid question, one that we've all asked ourselves at some point. How would your life change if you had money? And just like Squid Games, Kaiji intends to ask, how did the world end up in such a way where money is this important, where these death games are somehow a better option than the world outside? Kaiji is set in the middle of Japan's lost decade, a period of economic stagnation and high unemployment, with the batch of college graduates in this time being called the Lost Generation. But Kaiji is more than just lost, he's spiteful, his only other interest being to steal the emblems off of fancy cars and slash their tires, believing them deserving of it. It turns out that he's actually not wrong in this specific case, at least, as we'll see, but the point being, it gets him nowhere. It lets him feel a little better, but his situation is unchanged. In fact, it takes a turn for the worst when that aforementioned loan shark shows up and tells Kaiji that a line he co-signed for a previous co-worker has now fallen to him. The 3.85 million yen debt is now his to pay. This act of kindness and trust, putting his own neck on the line for someone else, has come back to ruin him. And that is crucial for everything that happens in Kaiji, that it all stems from this one act of selflessness, because as we'll see soon, Kaiji is full of these situations where someone has to choose between themselves and others. And some of those choices will make you angrier than anything you've ever seen, and yet part of you will understand why they chose themselves first. With his friend's debt passed to him, he faces working for 11 years with nothing to show for it. No hope at saving anything, no hope at buying a house, just a miserable job to stay afloat. Of course, this is just current life in the UK, and I'm sure plenty of other countries as well. And so he's given a way out. A cruise on the Espoir, the Ship of Hope, a night of mania where debtors gamble against each other, with around half surviving and clearing at least part of their debts, and the others being forced into labour camps to work it off. The conditions of which, as we see later on, are beyond horrific. It is the ship that borders heaven and hell, such is the power of money. Now, I know this series sounds exceptionally bleak on the surface, and it is outright morbid at times, but there's this tangible thread of optimism throughout. Initially, Kaiji is the kind of character that you don't admire at all. You know, I certainly felt like I could empathize with him and his frustrations of being directionless and that sense of, what the fuck am I doing with my days? But he's the complete opposite of inspiring. You know, he's an alcoholic gambling addict with no aspirations who throws away every penny to his name, and he regresses back to exactly that on more than one occasion. But the point is, he's also not remotely applying himself right now. We see throughout the series that his mind is as sharp as anyone's. He's observant and cunning, creative and calculating, and yet he's also a complete moron at times. He overestimates himself, he's foolish and makes terrible decisions in order to chase that gambling high again, and all of this makes him one of the most raw human characters I've ever seen. It's those exact flaws that make him, in his own way, so uniquely inspiring to me. And so with that, I'm going to quickly explain the rules for the game they play on the ship. Rock, paper, scissors. No, seriously, it's rock, paper, scissors. Like Squid Games, it keeps the games easily understandable and very simple on the surface. However, it turns into absolute insanity with just a couple of twists. So firstly, they get 4 cards of each type. 4 rocks, 4 scissors, 4 papers, a total of 12 cards. If they use scissors in the match, they put a scissors card face down, and then they lose that card and go down to 11 cards, and so on. Simple enough, right? They also get 3 stars and must wager at least 1 per match against their opponent. To clear the boat, they must use all of their cards by the end of the allocated time and have at least 3 stars. If they have extra, they can sell them at the end of the game to make some money. And if you're wondering how any of that changes the fact that this is still rock, paper, scissors, you're in for a real treat. But on the surface, it looks as though you have to play 12 matches and win at least 6 of them to maintain your 3 stars, whilst avoiding any crazy loss streaks that would cause you to run out of stars and get eliminated early. As such, a little under half of the players should clear it. However, and I will be extremely impressed if anyone is able to work this out and hasn't seen the series already, but there is a way for every single person to survive if they cooperate with each other. If you want to see if you can figure it out, feel free to pause the video and have a think. Every single person could safely survive if they all got 12 consecutive draws. If they cooperate with the person opposite them to use up all their cards, whilst remaining at 3 stars, they can both survive with an extremely manageable debt. There is enough for everyone to live. But the organisers made such a big deal out of having to beat the other players that the only person who realised it had played there before. It didn't occur to anyone else because the organisers made all the other players out to be an enemy, when in reality, they weren't. They were people in the exact same situation as Kaiji, turned against each other by the ones holding all the money, so they don't realise who the real enemy is. Because as soon as they do, there's far more of them than there are organisers. And as with many things in Kaiji, the social criticism here could not be any more blatant. However, I'm sure you can guess exactly what happens after the one person I mentioned pitches the idea to Kaiji. First, he accidentally puts the wrong card down. Then after claiming it was a mistake, and showing Kaiji his card for the next round, he secretly switches it out for another, a move he'd practiced over the last year purely for the purpose of coming here and making a profit, leaving Kaiji plunged into despair. With no cards remaining and just 1 star, it seems impossible for him to return. But even in this impossible situation, he continues to look for possibilities. And this is something I love about him. You know, no matter how far he sinks, he's always looking for a way out. He never gives up the idea of hope, no matter how brutally the world tries to take it away from him. And so, after some thinking, he teams up with 2 other players, one of which actually happens to be his old co-worker who ran off and left Kaiji saddled with the debt, but this is no time to be worrying about that. One of them has cards, one has stars, and Kaiji has money. Oh, I didn't mention this earlier, but before being told what the rules were, they were also given the option to borrow an amount of money between 1 and 10 million at an absurd interest rate of 40% per 10 minutes, which even on an illegal gambling ship shouldn't be allowed. But they can use this money however they want, buying stars or cards or whatever. Most people took just 1, but Kaiji took 10 million, meaning between the 3 of them, they have a small amount of everything. And so, I won't go into excruciating detail, but by exploiting the tendency of players to want to balance their cards, i.e. they'd, naturally want to keep an equal amount of rock, papers and scissors, as opposed to just having 4 scissors left in case someone finds out. But the gang find a player who'd just used rock and scissors in his last 2 games, and just kind of seemed like the type of player to care about that thing, and so get a small victory against his next inevitable paper, with a scissors card. And it's these kind of little details that you'd never think about just sitting and watching the series, but could absolutely understand how someone battling for survival would come up with it. And the scheme that follows is even crazier. I hadn't really mentioned this yet, but there's a large counter which shows the number of each card left on the floor. So how many rocks are left, how many papers, how many scissors. And Kaiji intends to buy a large number of rock cards, because as the number of cards dwindle, they'll have a much better sense of what cards are left on the field than anyone else. And of course, they could just, dispose of them through draws if they need to get back down to 0 cards. But if they knew they had all of the rocks remaining, they could play scissors safely. And at the time, there were far more scissors than papers. So if they continue to decline at an equal rate, Kaiji's rock cards have a great chance of winning because there won't be as many papers left on the field. And I try not to go for the story this much in these videos, but it's so difficult with Kaiji because it's all just so cool and so clever, and I just want to yap on about it forever. But I won't go through every tiny detail that happens, but it doesn't work out because someone else had the same idea of the papers. And Funai, the man who tricked them at the start, shows up and offers him a deal. If Kaiji sells his cards, Funai will give him the 3rd star he needs to survive. Freedom, safety, and escape from debt. He gets it all with this 1 star. And earlier he told his partners, think of the 3 of us as 1, and immediately afterwards, Ando ran off to try and win his own safety. Also, as I said, Furuhata is the reason he's in this nightmare in the first place. Neither of them have been any help in coming up with ideas so far, and so basically what I'm trying to get at here is these 2 are useless, untrustworthy bozos. And so in a situation like this, what would you do? Because if I'm being honest, there's no way I wouldn't take it. At minimum, as Funai says, hiding it in my pocket and still attempting to help the others get through if I can, but keeping my own safety net. You'd have to be insane not to. And yet, that is what Kaiji does. Not only turning down the star, but afterwards splitting up the money he had so that he wouldn't be able to buy a star himself. It's almost as though he wants to eliminate that possibility because he's afraid that he would. The idea that a potential to do that exists in him almost seems to repulse him, even though it's actually quite reasonable in my opinion. But Kaiji has decided that he'll win with these 2 or not at all. He opposes the very idea that Funai and the other organizers put forward that everyone would betray each other for their own personal gain. And this is something that he battles with throughout the rest of the series. But it is, of course, a sadly very naive belief from Kaiji that everyone has a moral compass like he does. I don't imagine I need to convince you of that. There are very obviously people out there happy to treat people in the worst, most unfair ways if it furthers their own gain. Funai's attempt to secretly rig the final matches backfires, with Kaiji exposing his cheating to everyone, leaving no one left willing to play him. He quite literally puts his life on the line to prove people are better than the organizers claim. Because as the time ticks down, even knowing that he'd lose, Funai has no choice but to face off against Kaiji in order to use his last card up. With no one else left, Kaiji is able to force Funai to wager 4 stars in order to do so. Given the trio 10 stars, which is plenty for them all to survive, but because they have an odd number of cards remaining, remember how I said they need to use up all of their cards, with an odd number left, they can't eliminate them through draws, and there's no time left anyway, so one of them will have to be eliminated. Now, as mentioned, they'd heard rumors of being able to potentially buy and sell stars afterwards, but there was no confirmation. Whoever held the cards is potentially doomed to a horrific fate. Drug testing, forced labor, none of them know the details, but it's going to be the stuff of nightmares. And yet Kaiji offers himself up without hesitation to save these 2 men who have both, at some point in time, betrayed him. And ever since he's walked on the ship, he's seen nothing but betrayal. And yet he puts his complete and utter faith in them, in the notion that humanity has a heart. But as soon as he walks away and he hears them promise to save him, he knows something is off. He knows something isn't right. When Kaiji's brought into the next room, he's stripped down and treated like an animal. And there's 2 significant characters here. First, Ishida, the picture of naivety. A man here to clear his family's debts. Quite an innocent man, right? And he was tricked by another player to go into this room and signal to him his opponent's cards in exchange for being saved afterwards. However, the man did not do so. The money was far more important to him than Ishida's fate. He is, of course, extremely similar to Kaiji. The other significant character here is Okabayashi. I hope I pronounced that even half correct, but he is the picture of cynicism, who believes cold leverage is all that matters and no human would help another without something in return, that people will always betray others in exchange for personal gain if they're able to, and hence he brought with him enough items to guarantee his allies as such, although I don't think he'd use that word, but to guarantee that they would buy him out. And in a scene that makes me sick to my stomach every time I watch it, on the other side of the glass, Ando weighs up saving Kaiji. If he saves him, he'll leave with around 3 million yen in debt, but if he doesn't, he keeps about 10 million for himself. He'll actually be able to start life over again. And so I'm sure you can guess which one he chooses. He leaves Kaiji, the man who carried them on his back, out of this hell to sink to an even lower one. And what really gets me about the scene is I would really like to think that I wouldn't do this and feel very confident saying that I wouldn't, but I think I'd be lying if I said that the thought wouldn't occur to me at all. Or if I was in mountains of crippling debt, if the debt was higher, if the money was higher, then the temptation would have definitely been there for me. Maybe that's just me, maybe I'm an awful person, right? But I feel like there's a part of us all, as awful as this is, that can kind of understand why he did it. And so as Furuhata turns and walks away, the guilt eating away at him, Kaiji as a series appears to paint a very bleak picture. There is, of course, no doubt that there are plenty of people out there who have decided to put their moral compass aside to earn their wealth, but on the other side of this wealth gap is money so powerful and becoming so scarce for the working man that we could one day be forced to do the same. And if so, how did it possibly come to this? In a desperate last bid for survival, Kaiji manages to steal Okabayashi's jewels that he was hiding, causing him to be the one saved instead. He confronts Ando in one of the most satisfying hits I've ever seen, but it's what follows that really interests me. Because after taking his stars back into cash, he's now not only survived, but he has more than enough to cover his debt and start over. He's essentially in the same position Ando was, but he's had enough, more than enough, of this miserable, unsightly mess of them all just scrapping for money, whilst those with plenty of it watch them for nothing more than entertainment. And one thing I really appreciate about Kaiji as a series is that it never loses sight of the fact that far more cruel, than any of the choices the players make, far more despicable than any of the schemes they use to survive. Far worse than any of that is the ones who forced them into this position in the first place. Sure, some of them are just here because, they're idiots who took on debt to gamble and blow every penny they have in the most ridiculous ways, but how many players here, like Ishida, are here just to save their family? How many of them are here because they had no choice but to borrow money due to the crazy high unemployment at the time? Or they have a job, but it didn't pay them enough to get by, whilst their bosses sit on millions? Kaiji sums it up perfectly. The sponsors on this ship couldn't have asked for more. They set us at each other's throats, and now they're laughing. And so in disgust at it all, Kaiji, in his words, throws away that money, 15 million yen, and opts to save Ishida, to the bafflement of those around him. And the thing is, it's easy to just say these things, It would have been very easy for the authors to just have Kaiji become this kind of pure-hearted saint, right? But let's both be honest here. If you left this boat afterwards with a 6.3 million yen debt at 18% annual interest, in essence, a debt that is impossible for him to pay off in his situation, and return to a miserable job that you hate and are isolated in, wouldn't you feel some regret? Would there not be a part of you that wonders what things would be like if you hadn't? It's that raw, honest look at that side of us that makes me love this series, because exactly that happens to Kaiji as he scoops up trash at his new job at 900 yen an hour, where he can't even make a dent on the principal. And the series doesn't shy away from the reality of working life either. The expectation to be motivated for a job that doesn't even pay enough to get by, where you get treated like dirt with no realistic hope of progression, and the ones who get the best treatment are simply the ones who suck up the most. Hard work is not rewarded, but you're expected to work as though it is. A lifetime of this lies ahead of him, so Kaiji seeks out the games once more. Of course, very similar to Squid Games, where the contestants are given the option to quit by the organizers, right, who know that they're here in the first place because they don't have the option to quit, and they know this. Right, they wouldn't have let them go after the VIPs paid millions to be there if they weren't certain that they'd come back, right? And Kaiji's past experience has made him very distrustful of everyone. Understandably, right? I think we'd all be exactly the same. He sees them all as enemies. He even tells the man he previously saved that they should see each other as such. He's become very jaded. He's lost sight of his belief that the world is good. And this next game definitely initially seems to prove him right. Compared to the Espoir, this one is way more sickening. The contestants have to cross a steel beam about 10 meters up in the air, enough to cripple them and break their bones, but not enough to kill them. Instead, the spectators get to watch them suffer and scream. But to me, that's not even the part that gets me the most. It's that if the last was a look into, how humans respond in times of crisis, how far they'd go to survive, this is more like the spectators want to see the same behavior they carry out themselves. Because it's not visible by the contestants when they first set off, but the beam gets narrower as it goes further along, which inevitably causes whoever set off first to have to slow down and the person behind them to catch up, which effectively forces the decision onto them: will they push someone off this beam for money? And it's even more so because they go in groups of 3, so the player in the middle also has the pressure of the person behind catching up to them. It's a literal push or be pushed situation, but one that Kaiji, despite initially resolving himself to go for, simply cannot bring himself to do. He refuses to cross that line, even if it means being pushed himself. He once again rebels against the idea that the spectators want from him, that he'd do whatever it took for personal gain. There are, of course, plenty of those around him which do exactly that. But despite that and all his talk about how the world was nothing but dog eat dog, he refuses to join them. Kaiji as a series, of course, isn't naive enough to pretend that people willing to go for any length for personal gain don't exist. It's quite the opposite. It's full to the brim of characters like that. But what's particularly interesting is the difference in everyone's behavior in this next game here. In this one, there's something to be gained from another's fall, compared to the next one, where there isn't a gain. And this is where the kind of unique optimism of the show begins to bloom from beneath its brutal surface. The organizers, as you could probably expect, effectively lied about the prizes in a kind of classic legal loophole way, putting a deadline on when it could be collected from the top of the building next to this one. It would take far too long to reach if they went down the stairs and back up, so to collect their prize, they must cross this narrow steel beam atop the skyscrapers, where falling is guaranteed death. But that's not the only difference. This time, everyone who crosses gets a prize. It's no longer this forced competition against each other, but rather a situation where the success or failure of their comrades has zero effect on their own rewards. And as soon as that's stripped away, how do you think they respond? Instead, they immediately begin to cheer each other on. That natural instinct that was buried beneath layers and layers of forced conflict still shines. We're not unnaturally turned against each other. The human instinct wants to support those around them, not tear them down. But atop these steel beams, they can do neither. They can neither help nor hinder, and no matter what they say to those around them, it doesn't help them balance. It doesn't stop 18 of them from falling. There was nothing any of them could do to help each other. And here Kaiji makes a comparison to our current lives that shook me to my very core. It claims that this isn't just true on the bridge, but everywhere, that every human on the planet walks their own steel beam of loneliness, that we all feel the same solitude as the men on top of these steel beams. We can never truly know what another is thinking. And obviously we've seen that firsthand with the amount of times Kaiji's been deceived. And yet we instinctively yearn to be truly understood, but we can't. In the same way that we can never truly understand another, we can't make anyone understand us. And so if there are 5.7 billion people, there are 5.7 billion different types of loneliness, all of which will die in utter solitude. Because all we can do is communicate with words that are so easily misunderstood and often weak, and as we've seen throughout Kaiji, can be intentionally deceptive for the cruelest of purposes. And yet these final two feel an instinctive warmth at knowing the other is there. The two men who, before this steel beam race started, preached about how it was every man for himself, but now find the deepest comfort in this nightmare from simply knowing they're not alone. It's both incredibly harrowing and kind of beautiful at the same time. No one else can walk our steel beams for us or stop us from falling. And there very well may be this space, this misunderstanding between us all that causes us all to feel our own unique solitude, and yet the companionship that we can provide one another is still enough. We have no idea of knowing how well our signal was comprehended, but there is nothing to do but trust the message is received. Now, obviously, in reality, we can, of course, to some extent, help or hinder someone else's crossing of their steel beam. And once again, Kaiji witnesses another betrayal as the supposed exit turns out to be a trap that sees Sahara fall to his death. And even once Kaiji finds a different entrance, he's once again deceived out of his prize. But after that whole thing about walking our own steel beams, we meet the man at the very top of this world, the head of the company behind these games. And he's shown to be someone who understands the world extremely deeply in his own cold, twisted way. He paid those who fell down earlier and didn't require immediate care to stick around despite their agonies. I'm just going to kind of summarize what he says here. Each life of plenty is supported by tens or hundreds of people groaning in their despair. I have the money to help, of course. It means practically nothing to me, and yet I won't. I have never helped anyone in my entire life, and I'll show you exactly why. He then proceeds to violently beat one of the men with a broken leg before turning back to Kaiji and saying, "I don't feel his pain. Whether he suffers or not is of no concern. The only thing of importance is my own happiness." It's almost a reversal of the steel beam metaphor earlier. He's not at all unable to help another man walk their beam. He's just completely unwilling. And Kaiji doesn't have much in the way of response. Based off the warmth he felt from Sahara's presence earlier, the idea of someone being so indifferent to another's suffering is inconceivable to him. And yet, it's extremely clear, naming no names here because I don't want to get into any legal trouble, but there's plenty of people out there, and a lot of them run very large companies. But it is, as Hyōdō says, they don't feel the suffering of their victims, so they're content to just turn a blind eye and live their lives. And don't get me wrong, this is obviously completely fucked up. And Kaiji even made a point earlier about how humans are the only animals which feel this guilt towards those they hurt. So it's fair to say that those who are able to push it aside simply aren't human. But this, combined with the whole steel beam thing, points to a brutal truth, that no one is coming to save us. Even the rare few we find willing to help are only able to do so much. However, Kaiji stands defiantly against this throughout the series. Despite repeated betrayals against him, he later on would band together with some of the men in the same hell he was, and when put in Ando's situation of keeping a crazy amount of money for himself or saving others, he chooses to save them in return. He's a man who, perhaps more than any of us, knows how brutal the world can be, and yet he refuses to join and spread that coldness himself. He's not naive enough to claim money doesn't matter, but it doesn't control him. It doesn't warp his behavior. And so I wasn't too sure where I was going to end this video when it started. It was mostly just I wanted to try and get more people to watch Kaiji, and if you do want to watch it, you can find it on Crunchyroll. If you want to skip the parts I've already covered, jump to episode 16. But whilst I could talk for ages about the rest of the series, including its spectacular manga, which sadly will probably never get adapted because part 3 is on Mahjong, and you saw how complicated a game as simple as rock, paper, scissors got, so you can imagine how complicated the Mahjong part gets. But even within just the anime, how in the labor camp they're not paid enough to cover the medical bills for the injuries caused by the work they're doing, or how the guys at the top of TI will win a completely rigged game, but then try to convince those around them that it was down to skill, which pops into my mind every time I hear some boomer claim that people my age can't get a house because of the £5 a week we spend on coffee. But with regards to the question that Squid Game tries to answer in terms of how did the world end up this way, I think the perfect place to end this video is with Hyōdō's speech on how he became a king. Man is willing to bear extraordinary things if one simply waves a bit of money under their noses. It is that eagerness which allows the rich to live in ease. If the poor were to all agree that they no longer had need of money, then the king would disappear. However, this will never happen, because in desperation to become the king themselves, they strive for money, reinforcing the position of the king, who will never allow them to become one. However, a king must still be careful. He must dispense to each their fair share of satisfaction, although in truth, he works them to their very bones.